In November and December of 2021, we did a mini-series on podcasting. We covered why you might consider starting a podcast, what it takes from acquiring equipment through production and delivery. We also talked about potential forms your podcast can take, and we revisit that topic on today's episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast as we speak with the host of one of our denominational podcasts whose show format just might be a winner for your local church. But even if you aren't considering starting a podcast for your ministry, don't leave. Trust me, today's conversation is applicable across many church marketing channels. Thank you to everybody for listening. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and my guest today is Crystal Caviness. She's the host of the Get Your Spirit in Shape podcast. Crystal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, let's begin by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you serve in the United Methodist Church.
I work for United Methodist Communications, and that is the communications agency of the denomination. And I work what we call the member team, member content team, which means that our team produces stories and podcasts and videos for members of the United Methodist Church. I've worked for United Methodist Communications for 8 years, and it's a work that I just really feel privileged to be a part of. I am a lifelong United Methodist, and so to get to serve the church in this way has been a real blessing for me. And I live in North Carolina now. The pandemic provided an opportunity to work from home. And even though our agency is based in Nashville, Tennessee, I relocated back to my hometown of High Point, North Carolina.
Well, that's awesome. I also work for United Methodist Communications for this podcast. And though I love the city of Nashville, I have never actually been to the building. I started when I lived in North Georgia, and now I live in Florida. So it's kind of cool how the United Methodist Church is, for all of the ways we may still be a little bit slow as a big institution, it is kind of cool how United Methodist Communications enables us to do some of this stuff.
Absolutely. And just, really is that whole connection that you can be in Florida and I can be in North Carolina and we can do this together. So
Absolutely.
I love that part of it.
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned in the intro, you host the Get Your Spirit in Shape podcast, which we recommended all the way back in January as one of the shows to check out in 2022. But for those who haven't been able to listen to it yet, can you tell us about the show and how you ended up hosting it?
Absolutely. And thank you, by the way, for that recommendation.
Yeah.
So the Get Your Spirit in Shape podcast was actually, it's the first podcast that United Methodist Communications produced. And my coworker, actually my boss, Joe Iovino, he was the creator and the original host of Get Your Spirit in Shape. After 100 episodes, he, yeah, right. I know. After 100 episodes, he moved into the producer role, and he asked me if I'd like to serve as co-host with him. So you can still hear Joe on some special episodes that we have, but he's always behind the scenes making sure our production is really top quality.
That's awesome. One of the main reasons I wanted to invite you on the show today is because I think the format of your show is one our listeners could absolutely adapt for their local setting. And I will once again refer our listeners back to those episodes from the end of 2021 where we talk about podcasting. If you have questions about equipment, recording, uploading, questions about the purpose of podcasting for a church, especially if you want to move beyond just posting your sermons, those episodes are still a great reference and are not terribly outdated yet, though the technology and things change all the time. But the two aspects that I love about your show that I think make it an attractive option for churches to try is number one, the interview format, and then number two, offering a practical spiritual exercise. When interviews are done well, they inform, they entertain, they engage, they challenge and inspire. And then either you or the guest usually offer up ideas for how to keep our spirit in shape. And you often highlight simple things that real people can work into their real lives that offer benefit. So how do you think about the ways in which your show and its format serves your audience? I know you inherited the show from Joe, but certainly I'm sure you've given time and thought to what it means to serve your audience.
Well, I think being a United Methodist, one of the filters for me is this something I would want to learn about? Is this a podcast episode I would listen to?
Mm,
And so a lot of times the answer of that is yes. I find this interesting, and I find this beneficial, or I want to hear more. A lot of times that also is one of those filters. Do I want to learn more?
yeah.
Our tagline is for the podcast is to information to help us keep our souls as healthy as our bodies.
Mm,
And so we really do believe that if we can encourage someone, if we can inspire someone, if if the listener says, "Oh my goodness, I can do that," or "I want to do that," or "That's really uplifting to me," then I feel like that's a win. Just to have a story, have an interview, have a topic that encourages someone to maybe try something a little different, or just really to encourage them in their walk, in their
yeah.
spiritual walk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we've been talking about serving our audiences, and that's really why I see podcasting as such a great tool for church marketing. It might not seem like it on the surface. It isn't the best venue for sharing times and dates of events, for example, because you never know when people are listening to podcasts. But it's a great way to create the kind of bond that leads to trust, and that can absolutely lead to people wanting to engage with you and your church beyond just the podcast. And so I would love to just hear from your experience with podcasting, both as a host and maybe as a listener. How has it helped you create connections or feel connected in ways that you wouldn't otherwise?
Dan, I when I finish a podcast episode, I feel like I've made a new friend.
Absolutely.
And probably I really like I was like, oh, this is my friend now, and I may actually be a little more too excited about that.
Yeah.
But it has I have made connections where especially because I'm a content creator.
Mm,
Maybe a few months down the road, I working on a story, and I remember that I had someone on the podcast that perhaps had that experience or could speak into the topic, and it's given me a chance to go back to them, and we already have that connection through Get Your Spirit in Shape. And so I've been able to really go a little deeper sometimes with some of our print stories as to maybe what that topic was. Or I'm thinking particularly about a minister we had on who talked about grief. And a few months later, we produced a piece of content, a print piece of print content about grief. And I was able to go back to him and dig a little deeper,
mm,
dive a little deeper about that. So it definitely has given me ways to connect with people that I might not normally connect with, particularly people in other parts of the world, other parts of the church's connection that my path may not have crossed with theirs. And that's really exciting to me because I do get excited about people who are so faithful in their walks and how they're serving the world, and to get to be a part of telling their story. That's one of the things I like best. So that's kind of how, as a host, I feel like I've been able to create some connections and bring those people's stories to our listeners. And as a listener, being a host has really helped me listen better, I
yeah.
think, to other podcasts. I like to listen to I've become a more avid listener, and I like to hear how other hosts interact with their guests. I feel like I'm really new at this. I've been hosting for I guess, about 14 months, and so I feel like, especially compared to Joe hosting 100 episodes, I'm really new at this. So I like to hear how other hosts interact with their guests, or how a format works. Um, I I listen to the MyCom podcast, and I love how it's very practical, and you know when that podcast is over, you're going to walk away with some list or some how to's, how
Awesome.
you can
Thank
do
you.
something. And I love that because if I'm going to give my time to listening to something, I'm hoping to get something from that, just to be honest. And so I love how you really do a great job with that, Dan. And I also love hearing personalities, because I think it gives us an opportunity to get to know people, get to know the host too. One of my favorite kind of non non-church podcast I listen to is called Office Ladies. It's kind of a guilty
Yes. Yeah.
pleasure of mine. Do you listen to
Oh,
Office
I
Ladies?
do every week. Yes.
Yeah, I love that Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey just give us this inside look, not only to the show The Office, but into their friendship. And now, I would tell you I'm their friend too.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's been a really fun way to get to connect with people, but also to hear how other people are using the podcast format.
Totally. And you and I, we were guests on a panel for International Podcasting Day back in September. And we talked in that conversation about how there's just something about people's voice in your ears. It's such an intimate experience. Like especially if you're like you listen to it in the car, it might be like radio, but if you listen to it in your earbuds while you're walking the dog or cleaning the house or doing something like that, it's almost like having a phone conversation and you're listening to somebody. And it really is cool. And we talked about this in that panel. When you're a host, it opens doors and you get to talk to people that if you didn't have a podcast, you would never, have the ability to have those kinds of conversations. I used to host another podcast about preaching, and a name our Methodist friends would recognize is Pastor Adam Hamilton from Church of the Resurrection. And he is so, giving with his time. He is constantly traveling all over the place and or hosting trainings and workshops at his church. And so he's not unreachable, but it is not really worth his time to give one pastor, 45 minutes. But because I had a recorder, and was like, well, and I'll share it with all the people that listen to my podcast, then it was worth his time. And so in a way, it opens up these amazing doors. But even if you aren't a host, like you and I, we become proxies. Like that friendship we feel, I hope our listeners feel the same way when it's done, because it really is just such a unique and powerful medium.
Absolutely. I wanted to say too that I think podcasts have a really unique ability to kind of peel back some layers,
Mm,
especially if you listen to the same podcast. I'm thinking about another United Methodist Communications podcast called The Compass that my coworker Ryan Dunn co-host or host rather, and I feel like I've gotten to know Ryan and
yeah.
all that he can do, and he's such a brilliant pastor and communicator. And I wouldn't maybe know that necessarily if I'm not listening regularly to his podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you do happen to be United Methodist Church that's interested in podcasting, Ryan has actually started a Facebook group. I think it's called UMC Podcasters. So like search for that on Facebook. I'm in there. Ryan's in there. It's a place where it's not super, super active, but if people have questions or we oftentimes share what we're working on, share episodes with each other. It's a really supportive place. So if you are a podcaster, you're starting one and you want a place to connect with other UMC podcasters, you can search for that group. But as I said earlier, I think the format of your show, the combination of an interview and practical exercises, is something that any of our listeners can easily and successfully adapt. And we'll start with the second part, the practical exercises. You close each episode by asking all of your guests the same question. Can you share what that question is and what some of your favorite answers have been?
Absolutely. We always ask our guest, how do you keep your own spirit in shape? And I love hearing that because these are people that I respect and excuse me, even if I've just started to know them or getting to know them, I've learned they have an area of expertise or they bring a really unique story to the podcast. And so I'm always anxious to hear their answer.
Yeah.
It's always kind of like this big reveal for me at the end. It's like, what are they going to say? So one of the answers that just really stands out is I interviewed a pastor and he said washing his Jeep is how he keeps his spirit in
Hmm.
shape. And he went through a very detailed and methodical ritual, if you will, on Fridays of washing his Jeep. And it kind of ends with him driving his clean Jeep, and if weather's permitting, the windows down, playing certain music on the radio. And he said that's so renewal. It's like this renewal for him, and I just love that because it really taught me that getting your spirit in shape doesn't have to be something that maybe is maybe more traditional that we might think of, like,
Yeah.
well, I spend my mornings in prayer, and we that obviously is one of the ways we can keep our spirit in shape, and people tell us that. But I loved hearing that something was a little atypical could also be so just so refreshing or so renewing for someone. I had someone recently tell me that she's learned to knit, and just getting lost in the routine of knitting
Mm,
is very it kind of takes her away from the chaos that can be life. And she when she finishes knitting a period of knitting, she just feels a lot calmer and much more at peace. And a real it becomes a real holy place, really sacred space for her when
yeah,
she picks up her knitting. So I that is the question, and I'm always very excited to hear what people share with us. And I
yeah,
appreciate that they share something that's really very personal, or
yeah.
could be very, very sacred, that they share that with us and our listeners.
Yeah, that's so true, and I love hearing that. I For me, it used to be mowing my lawn. When you
Mhm.
work in ministry, it's not common to have something you work on and then it's done and you see the fruit of your labor immediately. you know,
Yes.
Especially when it's relational, or you're working on a sermon that you might deliver in a couple days, and then you deliver it, and then all you have is facial expressions and maybe a email on Monday morning, and so in some ways it was like that just the act of mowing the lawn, like washing your car or knitting something, like you can actually see like the fruit there in front of you, which is a really nice reminder that like you are making a difference in the world, even if you can't always see it. So
Mhm.
that's cool. I love answers like that. And I'm thinking too, if a church wants to adapt this kind of style, they may look at you can certainly interview the people in your congregation, and you can interview people in your community. I think it would be a really great format for highlighting the people in your community and making your church kind of the place that lifts up the stories in your community, whether it's a city or a town or a county. And so some of these people you may be interviewing, they might not have a spiritual practice to offer because they might not be people of faith, or they may be people of faith who aren't super comfortable sharing about that because their job is in some other arena. And so I think we too, as church volunteers, leaders, staff people, you could certainly work with your pastor if you aren't one as well. You can almost go and listen to the interview at a later time and pick out the themes of what they talk about in the interview. Pick out the challenges or the questions that they wrestle with in their story, and then you can come in later and record maybe a guided meditation or a set of prayer questions, like some things to pray about or some scripture verses. It'll help the listener engage with the topic. We have a lot of spiritual discipline resources available through Discipleship. You could also just go get a copy of Richard Foster's a Celebration of Discipline, and that's almost like a menu of different practices that you could offer and customize based on the themes of the interview. And so I want to hear from you. How might this help turn something like a podcast, which, I love Office Ladies, but it is entertainment. It is
Right, that's
purely
right.
entertainment. It's a way to pass time in the car or while doing chores, walking the dog. I love I've seen The Office through multiple times, so I love hearing all those stories, but it's entertainment. So how do you see something like this being able to transform this medium from just entertainment or just information into an avenue for discipleship?
I we believe that the church is to be a connected body. That we're not to do life alone, to live in our faith. To express our faith alone, and so I believe the podcast has a way to connect us with other people, to with the power to inspire and encourage each other, really one another through those stories. And you mentioned story just a few minutes ago, and story is so powerful. We all
Yeah.
have stories. And so, just having this avenue, just having this podcast, is a way for to reach people that you might not reach.
Yeah.
It's a way to. I mean, I'm not a pastor, so I'm not. People aren't coming to me to ask me, well, how can I do this, or how might I, what's the best way to study the Bible, or anything
Mm.
like that. But through the podcast, it's an opportunity for me to let other people share those kinds of practices, or those kinds of disciplines, or just the stories that might inspire someone. So I feel like it's just an opportunity. It's another way. It isn't the only way, but it's
Right.
another way that you can reach people, and just provide resources and again encouragement.
Absolutely. And that transitions so well into where we are going. I can tell you are a podcast host as well because we're setting each other up. But, we asked our listeners at the beginning who maybe aren't into podcasting themselves, not planning on doing it, don't have the equipment, all that, to hang in there. And I hope that they have, because it's the other aspect of your show, the interview. That's something I think is so widely applicable. And being good at interviewing is a skill that might not be on our radar as a church marketing or communications person. We think of things like writing or designing or photography or video editing, but being able to interview someone, that can become your secret weapon. And so beyond just being a common podcasting format or being the format you inherited when you became the host of Get Your Spirit in Shape, what do you see as the power of the interview?
Everybody has a story. Being able to build a space where someone trusts you
Mm,
to open up and share their story, that's that's the goal. That's my goal,
yeah.
to be patient and thoughtful and gentle when you're asking questions, when you're just paying attention to what someone's telling you. And even though, as we are recording this podcast, you and I aren't in the same room, but we still have tone and inflection,
Yeah.
and you can hear, I believe you can hear smiles in people's, in people's words. And so I really think the power of the interview gives you that opportunity where it just breaks down. It has the potential to break down barriers where we just communicate with one another as people who are on this earth journeying through whatever we're journeying through, and sharing those stories. I can learn from you, you can learn from me. Let's just provide an opportunity to, my role as the host, to ask some questions that allows you to tell your story and share your experiences. I One of the ways I describe myself, and what I do, is I say that I'm a fearless champion of stories for the United Methodist
Mm,
Church. I love the stories of the United Methodist Church, and I love being in those local churches. One of the favorite parts of my job outside of podcasting is I get to travel to local churches and see what people are doing and help them tell their story. And there's no end of stories, and that's why I think the format of the interview format is so powerful. There is absolutely, it is an infinite source of stories, and sometimes you just have to go find them, but most of the times you just have to look for them, because everybody has one. Everybody, I believe, can offer some insight or some words that might inspire you or inspire me, or speak to someone in a special way. So that's why I love the format of the interview.
yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say it is a blast to do. Like you and I both have talked about how you feel like you leave an interview like you've got a new friend.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's not for everybody, but I love it. I love doing interviews, and this podcast is a mix of interviews and kind of monologues, or a set of teaching, a practical teaching on a topic. And I love preparing those as well. But I always get geared up and excited for interviews. It's one thing to talk by yourself in the spare bedroom of your house for 15 minutes. It's another thing to get to actually connect with another human being and to hear their expertise and perspective. And that's how we broaden our horizon, how we gain empathy for one another, is by listening to each other's stories. And so getting to be the people that like draw that out of someone and encounter it firsthand, but also getting to share it with the world is so huge. And so I hope our listeners can see that when an interview is done well, it creates an engaging story. It can be used to highlight important events and issues and conversations that need to be had. And that's something that all church communicators need to know how to do. You might not have a podcast, but you might use video or the written format. Like Crystal writes articles as well. She's talked about that in our interview today. And you might share testimonies in worship or on social media or on your website. You might highlight the stories of your community, even people outside of your church, as a way to connect your church to your community. But of course, the challenge is that interviewing is actually a skill. It isn't just being good at talking. So, in your 14 months as the host of an interview podcast, what have you learned about the art and skill of interviewing?
Well, there are some obvious ones. Don't ask yes, no questions because then you're just going to be stuck with some awkward silence when someone says yes or no, and
Yeah.
and it stops there. So that's a pretty obvious one. But I hope that I've become a better listener.
Yeah.
I A lot of times or every time I will prepare for my interview and I'll come to the podcast interview with a list of questions. And early on in my podcasting, I was I was very methodical about going through my questions one, two, three, four, five. And sometimes someone would jump ahead to question five and I'm still on number two. And I would
Yeah.
back them up to number two. Wait, we're not there yet. We'll talk about it, but we're not on number five yet. And so I've learned to relax and let it be a conversation.
Mm,
That's and just to listen and let a lot of times the real gems of a conversation are they're going to pop up where you least expect it. You're not, you can't script those golden moments.
yeah.
But if you listen to where someone's inflection changes perhaps, or you can tell there's more emotion, whether that emotion is maybe some, happy or joy or sad, whatever. If there's a shift in emotion, listening to that, giving it the space to really let someone share their thought
Yeah.
and without I would normally have been like, okay, next question. And really, it's like, sorry, we can't talk about your joy right now. We have the next question.
Yeah.
So I think I've become a better listener. I know I still need to be a better listener, but that's to me one of the just really the if when you talk about skill is kind of getting out of your own way and not I mean, of course I have a topic I want to, cover and discuss, but not feeling like maybe loosening my
Yeah.
hold on it a little bit is a good way to say that.
Yeah.
Let it have room to move and on its own organically.
Oh, totally. I used to joke that if you're so like tied into your list of questions, you might as well have just sent it to them and then they record their own answers. It's almost like those old quizzes in the teen magazines. You just move from question to question. But yeah, like being willing to throw out your plans and follow. We would say where the spirit leads, but like follow the emotion or follow the key insight, and part of that is knowing your audience and knowing what they need to know and what is their experience like, because the other challenge is you get going in a conversation, you just follow what's interesting to you, and then suddenly you realize you're like way off in the weeds. So
It's true. I mean,
yeah.
that is such a good point, Dan, because I can see that I'm like, oh man, I love this. And sometimes I'll just stop and I'll kind of make a mental note. Maybe they can come back another time and we can talk
Yeah.
about that topic. But I have, there's been a few times where I've realized I am treading on very holy ground with that
Mm,
person, and I've acknowledged that. I've said, if this feels too personal, we don't have to talk about it.
yeah.
And I've been so humbled and really felt privileged when the person would say, no, it's good. Yeah, I want to talk about it, and no, I don't mind sharing about that. So if when you get to those spaces, it is, yes, we are producing podcast. It's part of what we do in our role at United Methodist Communications, but we're also someone's trusting us with their story,
Yeah.
and it's important to keep that in mind.
Well, like your show, I too have a wrap up question that I like to ask all of our guests. And that is, what words of encouragement do you have for the folks that are doing the hard work of church marketing and communications?
Well, you use the right term. It is hard work. It's hard to stay creative and engaging, but I would say that to trust yourself. If you're in this role either because you've been doing it for a while and you have experience and skills, or it's something that interests you. There's always so many resources out there. Don't feel like you're doing this by yourself. You aren't.
Yeah.
There's church communicators. There's a whole a whole tribe of us,
Yes.
and we love helping one another. I mean, definitely we are resources for each other. So find those people who are doing the same thing you're doing, and become, let be a network for each other. That's something I would say for sure, so that you're not doing it by yourself. But trust yourself. If you think it's interesting, chances are the people in your church are going to find it interesting too. So that's why I said earlier, as a United Methodist, if I think something is like, I have some questions about that, I guarantee you I'm not the only one who has questions
Yeah,
about that.
absolutely.
So if it interests you, it probably interests someone else. So to trust that instinct, and then go find those people who are doing the same work as you, and kind of band together and be there for one another.
That's really, jumping back to the previous question, one of the skills of being an interviewer is actually having the courage to say, okay, this may be a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Mhm.
Because if you're confused about it, even if it seems really simple, there are tons of other people out there who are confused by it, who may not have the courage to ask it. And so your willingness to ask it on a microphone, being recorded, that's a critical skill as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to be, you got to put yourself out there. You have to be bold for sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of those connections with colleagues, if any of our listeners wanted to follow your work or reach out and say hi or ask you questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, the podcast and all the content for United Methodist is at umc.org. That's the denominational website. And on the homepage, there is a section where the Get Your Spirit in Shape podcast, the most current episode, is always on the homepage. I'm happy to receive emails from folks, and my email address is ccaviness at umcom.org. That's CCAVINESS at umcom.org. It's harder to spell it. It's
Yeah.
easier to say it. It's harder to spell it.
Yeah. Well, Crystal, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your experience and expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Well, now, listeners, we want to hear from you. How might you use the stories you gather through interviews to reach your community? Or what practical disciplines or spiritual exercises do you think would resonate in your area? Email us at podcast@umcom.org, and we just might share your thoughts or stories on a future episode. And you can, of course, use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions you have for the show. We always love hearing from you. And as always, the easiest way to support the show and help other church communicators like yourself find it is by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to us right now. And did you know that United Methodist Communications has celebrated over 80 years of ministry? Your support ensures that the latest denominational news, dynamic stories, and informative articles will continue to connect our global community. Make a tax-deductible donation today at resourceumc.org/giveumcom. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Market